I love Hadestown. And what's not to love about it? Catchy folk music, Greek mythology, Your Dad and Mine Patrick Page, snazzy suits, Amber Gray being a wine ant, the best 2 seconds in Broadway history, and the long-awaited reunion for Spider-Man Turn Out the Dark. But there's a lot more to Hadestown's history than meets the eye. It began life in 2007 as a stage play by folk musician Anais Mitchell. But after it failed to really take off, it was adapted into a concept album, which then took off so hard it left behind a crater, and Hadestown returned to the stage. There were a couple of off-Broadway productions before it finally moved in 2019 to the biggest stage of them all. No, not WrestleMania. So, with the recent uptick in our collective free time, I figured it would be fun to go over the original concept album and see how it eventually grew into the Broadway hit we all know and love. From stage to album to stage again, this is Hadestown, 2010 to 2019. Let's start off with the aspect of Hadestown that has changed the least between editions: the story. It's the classic myth of Orpheus and Eurydice mixed in with 1930s iconography. A struggling musician named Orpheus and a nymph named Eurydice get married. Eurydice goes to work in the hyper-capitalist underworld to help provide for the two of them, and ends up not being able to leave. Orpheus travels to the underworld, and with the power of love songs, convinces Hades to give him his wife back. Just so the rest of the workers don't get any funny ideas about leaving, however, Hades makes a game of it. Orpheus will need to lead Eurydice, and if he ever looks behind him to make sure she's following, she has to stay forever. They just about make it to the end of the road, but Orpheus breaks from the pressure and turns around, dooming Eurydice to an eternity of servitude. Now, if you've only listened to the Broadway version, you'll probably notice 2 things missing from my summary, those being the failing marriage of Hades and Persephone, and the fact that the Broadway musical is set in a post-apocalypse caused by f***ed up weather patterns. Yeah, most of those seem to be Broadway editions, or at least stage editions. The concept album seems to only take place during an economic recession. Granted, one that affects the gods themselves, but still. With regards to Hades and Persephone, their relationship is fine, actually. They're maybe a little distant, but we don't see them have any huge spats like on the stage. Sure, they argue with each other on how long, but, well, couples argue. And here it remains pretty civil. He's not possessive of her, and she doesn't seem to disapprove of what he's done to the afterlife. Outside of her running her speakeasy, of course. And these changes make sense, since on stage and in the original mythology, the relationship between the death gods is what causes the seasons to change. And with that relationship thrown out of whack, the seasons go with it. Incidentally, this also reduces epic from a song with the magical ability to restore balance to just a song that reignites Hades' sense of empathy. Still a banger, though. Theirs isn't the only relationship that's been changed, however. On the stage, Orpheus and Eurydice have a very Disney romance, for want of a better term. We start with Orpheus watching Eurydice and pining after her, go right to the meet-cute, and then straight to them making wedding plans and living together. Meanwhile, on the concept album, we open with the wedding song. That, combined with this minor lyric change on Hey Little Songbird, paints a picture of a long-term couple who are simply nervous about tying the knot in the middle of a recession. Just to clarify, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. I love Disney romances, and Orpheus and Eurydice have buckets of chemistry. And I might be spoiled by musicals like Hamilton or Les Miserables that very clearly illustrate the passage of time, but I call it like I see it. The final major plot change is how much we learn about Hadestown itself. with no chant, no Way Down Hadestown reprise, no Wait For Me reprise, and parts and other songs that were Broadway additions, the workers of Hadestown really only show up on Why We Build the Wall and a little bit of Our Lady of the Underground. The reduced presence makes Hades' anxiety on his Kiss the Riot come a little bit out of left field. We don't get much of a physical description of Hadestown either, other than from Orpheus and Eurydice on songs like Way Down Hadestown and Epic 1, before either of them have ever gone to Hadestown. The most reliable description we get is of the road to Hadestown by Hermes. Lastly, I want to go over a story change that might not be significant in any way, but is unintentionally hilarious. It's this 3-song stretch right here. They're all still there, but the order is what's important here. On Broadway, we hear Orpheus get the piss beat out of him, if that drum solo is anything to go by, and told to just lay down and give up, but he still stands up to face Hades. On the concept album, however, Orpheus gets told to give up, vows to fight for the one he loves, and then gets the piss beat out of him.
How many times do we have to teach you this lesson, old man?
I love the young people.
I went over most of the differences with Hades and Persephone in the last section, so let's start this character discussion with the rest of the gods, Hermes and the Fates, who are little more than extras on the album. Hermes shows up on 2 songs and barely has a presence on either of them. Hermes is basically just Orpheus's fairy godfather. We don't get the father-son dynamic of the Broadway play, or even their friendship from 2017. The Fates are in the same boat. They show up for 2 songs, at the end of one song, in the background of another, and then they're gone. They're basically just the voice in the main characters' heads whenever they have a panic attack. So I guess their sporadic appearances are actually pretty accurate. No, the really interesting changes lie with our main couple, Orpheus and Eurydice. Vive Carni's Orpheus is a himbo. There's no other way to say it. He's shy, dorky, does photography, has that pretty boy tenor, looks good in spandex. Sorry, what were we talking about? Justin Vernon, on the other hand, and yes, that is Justin Vernon of Bon Iver performing Orpheus's vocals, is a straight-up guitar bro. He's cocky and self-centered and way more willing to cut loose. Damon Dono in the 2017 version is somehow even more of a bro, especially with the confidence of his toast on living it up on top and this baffling line delivery.
Where is she? Where is she?
Despite his swagger when compared to his Broadway counterpart, Vernon's Orpheus has an even harder fall. If it's true, it's more about Orpheus having a crisis of faith and not being able to live without Eurydice, and less about unionizing the dead and seizing the means of production. While Doubt Comes In is largely a solo piece where Orpheus spirals with minimal pushing from the Fates. Overall, Vernon's Orpheus is a more tragic character, and, in my opinion, a more interesting one than Carni's. And then there's Eurydice, who's arguably more the protagonist of the concept album than Orpheus. I mean, it's her alone on the cover instead of The Flower or Larry. It starts as early as the 3rd song on the album, where instead of the Fates talking about all the good things that come out of Hadestown, it's Eurydice alone who opposes Orpheus and Hermes. Then, when Hades comes to seduce her into coming to Hadestown, she accepts without any pressure at all from the Fates. The Fates only chime in with when the chips are down after Eurydice has accepted Hades' deal, directing the song more at the audience who would dare judge her for her decisions. Despite her increased cynicism here, she still comes to regret her decision and longs for Orpheus to return to her. There's this glorious moment on Epic 2 where, even with all the overdubs and multi-tracking, you can clearly hear Eurydice join in and sing along with Orpheus. Ultimately, Orpheus and Eurydice have a lot more emotional range in the concept album. Greater heights of love and hope, lower valleys of cynicism and despair. pretty impressive when you consider that the concept album is less than half the length of the Broadway version, especially when you realize that most of these changes come through in tiny lyric tweaks and changing around the order of songs rather than any aspect of the performance. Though, speaking of performance, perhaps not surprisingly, when you go from an indie album recorded in somebody's murder dungeon to an official Broadway cast recording, there's going to be a lot of differences, sonically speaking. Most of these don't really affect the plot or themes, but I thought they'd be fun to talk about nonetheless. When it comes to instrumentation, the concept album is a lot more ramshackle, with more traditional folk instruments like the accordion, harmonica,
pedal steel guitar,
and distorted rock guitar, and a lot less chorus than the concept album. This is likely the reason we didn't hear much from the residents of Hadestown on the concept album. And while I do normally love choruses and the amazing vocal harmonies they supply, I do love me some harmonica. On the vocal side, we have some small but interesting changes with our main cast, largely due to them mostly being musicians instead of actors. This is most likely the reason for the Fates having a, let's call it a dry inflection. I like to think it works though, since they are meant to be the uncaring embodiments of fate and destiny. Also, fun fact, they were played by actual triplets. Look it up. Anais Mitchell as Eurydice has similarly little to comment on, apart from her much more pronounced southern accent, adding to the album's... Wait, isn't she from Vermont? Oh, looks like I spoke too soon about the performers on this album not being actors. Annie DeFranco's Persephone and Greg Brown's Hades come off as less theatrical, for want of a better word. Amber Gray's abrasive, rough attitude is replaced by DeFranco's smoother, more sultry tones, calling to mind your stereotypical speakeasy owner in the 1930s, one who evidently doesn't get high on her own supply. Greg Brown, while no less a rumbling mountain of a bass than Patrick Page, is more cool and slow and drawling, making him seem less like an imposing lord of the dead and more like a snake oil salesman or greedy business tycoon. Hermes and Orpheus, on the other hand, are somehow more theatrical than on Broadway. With regards to Justin Vernon's Orpheus, as I said earlier, his lower register leaves him a more confident and relaxed version of the character, but there's one specific change I want to point out here. Listen to these two snippets from the same song.
Love her when I sing my song, all the rivers sing along.
Love her when I sing my song, all the rivers will sing along.
Justin Vernon's vocals are overdubbed. No other character on the album has this except for him, which makes sense thematically. Orpheus, in the mythology, is the son of Apollo, the god of music, and a literal muse, so it makes sense that his godlike musical talents allow him to form all these beautiful harmonies by himself. And lastly, there's Hermes, played by Ben Knox Miller of the band Low Anthem, who swaps out Andre DeShield's age and texture, or even Chris Sullivan's low, relaxed baritone for
Follow that dollar for a long way down, far away from the poorhouse door. Either get to hell or to Hadestown.
I could try and attach some thematic significance to this. All the gods have simply stopped caring in the face of hard times, with the lordly Persephone and Hades drawing inward, while the trickster Hermes letting himself go a bit. But honestly, it's just really funny to me, and the closest thing to a jump scare I have ever heard in a musical. Going into the concept album, I honestly expected to hear a glorified first draft. A good first draft, but a work that was fundamentally incomplete somehow. I didn't get that at all. I got something akin to, say, a really good film adaptation of a book. And yes, I know the concept album came first, just roll with me. It's an abridged telling of the story, but it's a complete and satisfying story in its own right. I don't feel that the existence of the Broadway version negates the existence of the album. Hadestown the album is a tragedy. A story of how hard times and circumstances beyond our control can do irreparable harm. Hadestown, the Broadway play, tells us that stories, truly great ones, are worth telling over and over again, digging into and exploring and dissecting, because in doing so, we might just find something new, not only in the story, but in ourselves. And what a fitting message for a story that's gone through so many incarnations. Thank you all so much for watching. I've been wanting to do this video for almost a year now, and I'm so glad to finally have it out. A huge thank you to my supporters on Patreon for their patience during these weird changing times on my channel. As always, my name is Aura. Trans rights. I don't know about you boys, but if you're like me, then hanging around this old manhole is bringing you down. 6 feet under, getting under your skin. Cabin fever is setting in. You're stir crazy, stuck in a rut. You could use a little pick-me-up. I can give you what it is you crave. A little something from the good old days. I got the wind right here in a jar. I got the reed on top at the bar. I got sunshine up on a shelf. Allow me to introduce myself. Now, brother, what's my name? My name is Our Lady of the Underground. Brother, what's my name? Our Lady of Ways, Our Lady of Means. Brother, what's my name? My name is Our Lady of the Upside Down. You wanna know my name? I'll tell you my name. Persephone.